My life was nothing short of ordinary: a steady job, a decent home, and a wife I thought was my soulmate. We had been married for 15 years, a span long enough to weather the typical ups and downs, or so I thought. Linda and I had built what seemed like a solid life together. We weren't the perfect couple, but we had our routine, our rituals, and the kind of comfort that comes with years of familiarity. Looking back, I guess the warning signs had been there all along, but I dismissed them as part of the normal wear and tear of a long-term relationship. We were both in our early 40s, with 2 kids, Sarah and Lizzie, who were just entering their teenage years. I worked in logistics, a job that kept me busy but allowed me to be home most evenings. Linda, on the other hand, was a stay-at-home mom. She had chosen to leave her job at a nursery to focus on raising our girls, something I respected and supported. We were your average suburban family, living in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much happened. Our lives revolved around our kids' school activities, weekend barbecues with neighbors, and the occasional date night when we could squeeze one in. I thought we were happy, or at least, I thought Linda was happy. But then things started to shift. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when the distance between us began to grow, but I know it was around the time Linda started to change. It was subtle at first. Less interest in spending time together, more time spent on her phone or with her friends. I noticed, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. After all, we had been married for so long. Maybe this was just a phase. Linda became more irritable, easily frustrated by the smallest things. I chalked it up to stress, maybe from dealing with the kids all day, or just the general strain of life. But the changes didn't stop. Our sex life dwindled, going from infrequent to almost non-existent. She started dressing differently, more provocatively, even when she claimed to be just running errands or meeting friends. I would come home from work and find her in the middle of a heated text conversation, her phone quickly slipping into her pocket when she heard me walk in. When I asked who she was texting, she'd shrug it off, saying it was just her friends from the book club or some nonsense about needing her own space. There were also the late-night trips out of the house, something she'd never done before. She'd give vague explanations about needing to clear her head or run out for something she forgot at the store. But each time she came back hours later than expected, and her excuses seemed less and less believable. The thing that really began to gnaw at me was the phone. Linda was never one to be overly attached to her phone, but recently, it became a permanent fixture in her hand, as if it were an extension of her body. She guarded it fiercely, snapping at me if I so much as glanced in its direction. Once I joked about how she was more married to her phone than to me, but the look she gave me in return was anything but amused. One night, she even got into bed fully dressed, her phone clutched tightly as if she feared it would be snatched away. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, Linda wasn't the type to cheat. She was a good wife, a good mother. We were a team, weren't we? But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It grew stronger every time I saw her smile at a text or disappear into another room to take a phone call. The doubts were starting to suffocate me, and yet, I did nothing. I didn't want to confront her, didn't want to believe that there could be anything more sinister at play. Instead, I convinced myself that it was just a rough patch, that we'd get through it like we always had. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that we were just in a rut, and that eventually, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong. What I didn't realize was that the life I thought I knew, the marriage I thought was secure, was about to come crashing down in the most brutal way possible. The truth was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And when it did, it would destroy everything I had ever believed in. The day it all came crashing down started off like any other. It was a Tuesday, uneventful and routine. I woke up early, got the girls ready for school, and kissed them goodbye as they headed out the door. Linda was still asleep when I left for work, which had become a bit of a habit lately. I remember glancing back at her, thinking how peaceful she looked, and how I missed the days when we would wake up together, laughing and talking about our plans for the day. Work was busy as usual, with meetings and deadlines that kept my mind occupied. But despite the distractions, there was that familiar knot in my stomach, that uneasy feeling that had been following me around for weeks. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. I just couldn't put my finger on it. That evening, I came home a little earlier than usual. Linda wasn't expecting me until later, and I thought it might be nice to surprise her. Maybe take her out for dinner, or at least have some time together before the girls got home from their after-school activities. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was gone, which wasn't unusual. But for some reason, it set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to shake it off as I walked inside, but the emptiness of the house only made the feeling worse. I dropped my keys on the counter and noticed her phone charger on the kitchen table. The cord still plugged into the wall, but no phone in sight. Linda never left without her phone. It was practically glued to her hand these days. I decided to wait, figuring she would be back soon. I turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself from the growing unease, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering, thinking about the changes in Linda, the secrets she seemed to be keeping. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called her. The phone rang twice before it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. That uneasy feeling turned into something darker, more insidious. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I stood up, pacing the living room, trying to rationalize my fears. Maybe she was just out with friends, or maybe she had gone to pick up something for dinner. But as much as I tried to calm myself down, the thoughts kept spiraling. What if she was with someone else? What if all those late-night trips and secretive texts were more than just paranoia? I decided to take a drive, hoping that getting out of the house would clear my head. As I drove through our neighborhood, I scanned every street, every car, hoping to spot her. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. I was about to turn around and head back home when I saw it. Her car, parked in front of a small, nondescript building on the edge of town. It was a place I had driven past 100 times without giving it a second thought. A dingy-looking dive bar with a faded sign hanging over the door. Without thinking, I pulled over and parked a few spaces away. My hands were shaking as I sat there staring at her car, willing myself to calm down. Maybe she was just meeting a friend, I told myself, but the excuse sounded hollow, even in my own head. I needed to know what was going on. I got out of the car and walked toward the bar, my heart pounding louder with each step. The place was almost empty, just a couple of guys nursing beers at the counter and a bored-looking bartender flipping through a magazine. I scanned the room, and that's when I saw her. Linda was sitting in a booth near the back, her back to me, and she wasn't alone. There was a man sitting across from her, leaning in close, too close for comfort. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The man was younger than me, maybe in his mid-30s, with a cocky grin and a hand resting casually on Linda's knee. My stomach twisted as I watched her laugh at something he said, her hand resting on his arm, fingers tracing little patterns on his skin. It was intimate, far too intimate for two people who were just friends. And then, without warning, she leaned in and kissed him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I watched them. My mind went blank, a roaring in my ears drowning out everything else. Linda, my wife, the mother of my children, was kissing another man. And not just a peck on the cheek, a deep, passionate kiss that left no room for misinterpretation. For a moment, I was frozen in place, unable to move or think. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. But then something inside me snapped, eyed me. The rage I had been holding back for weeks, months, maybe even years came flooding out in a tidal wave of fury. I don't remember crossing the room, but suddenly I was there, standing over their table, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles were white. Linda looked up, her eyes widening in shock as she realized who was standing in front of her. The man she was with turned, his smug grin faltering when he saw the look on my face. "What the fuck is this?" I spat, my voice low and dangerous. I could barely recognize myself. The anger in my voice was foreign, something I had never heard before. Linda stammered, trying to pull her hand away from the man, but it was too late. The damage was done. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the panic as she realized there was no talking her way out of this. The man stood up, trying to act tough, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Hey man, calm down. It's not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like?" I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think I'm fucking blind? I saw you. I saw everything." Linda tried to step between us, her hands on my chest, but I shoved her aside. My eyes locked on the man who had been touching my wife. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," I snarled, taking a step closer. He tried to back away, but the booth trapped him. "Look, I didn't know she was married, okay? Let's just calm down and talk about this." "Talk about this?" I echoed, my voice shaking with rage. "You think I want to talk to you, you piece of shit?" And then without thinking, I swung. My fist connected with his jaw with a sickening crack, sending him crashing back into the booth. He groaned, clutching his face, but before he could recover, I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back to his feet. Linda was screaming, begging me to stop, but I didn't hear her. All I could see was red. All I could think about was the months of lies, the nights spent wondering where she was, who she was with. All the pain and betrayal boiled over, and I unleashed it all on the man who had dared to touch my wife. I hit him again and again, each punch driven by the fury I'd been holding back for so long. He tried to fight back, but he was no match for the rage that had taken over me. I could feel his blood on my knuckles, hear the sickening thud of my fists against his flesh, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. It wasn't until I felt someone grab my arm, pulling me back, that I finally came to my senses. The bartender had come around the bar, his face pale as he tried to drag me off the man. "That's enough, man. You're gonna kill him." I let go, stumbling back as reality crashed down around me. The man slumped to the floor, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, his eyes dazed and unfocused. Linda was kneeling beside him, tears streaming down her face as she begged him to wake up. I looked down at my hands, trembling, covered in blood, his blood. The room was spinning, the adrenaline fading, leaving me feeling hollow and numb. I had just beaten a man half to death in a dingy bar over a woman who had betrayed me. The absurdity of it all hit me like a ton of bricks, and I stumbled back, my legs barely able to hold me up. Linda looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Maybe regret, maybe disgust. "Jake, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not what you think. I can explain." But I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear any more lies. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the bar, my mind reeling, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The life I had known, the life I had built with Linda, was gone. And there was no going back. I don't remember much about the drive home, except that it was too quiet, too dark, and too full of thoughts I didn't want to have. The image of Linda kissing that man kept flashing in my mind, like a movie reel stuck on a scene I couldn't shut off. My hands were still trembling as they gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles raw and bloodied from the fight. I felt numb, as if I were drifting through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I finally pulled into our driveway, the house looked eerily peaceful, as if it hadn't just been rocked by the earthquake of betrayal that had shattered my life. I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, trying to gather the strength to go inside. I knew that once I walked through that door, I would have to face the reality of what had just happened. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car, my legs stiff and unsteady. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, and the familiar scent of home hit me like a punch to the gut. This place, once my sanctuary, now felt like a stranger's house, haunted by the ghosts of memories I wasn't sure were real anymore. I could hear the sound of Linda's car pulling into the driveway behind me, but I didn't wait for her. I walked straight into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. I needed a moment to breathe, to process the whirlwind of emotions that were tearing me apart. But there was no time for that. The front door opened and I heard her footsteps, hesitant, cautious, like she knew she was walking into the lion's den. I didn't look up when she entered the room, but I could feel her presence, hovering at the edge of my vision, unsure of what to do or say. "Jake," she began, her voice shaky, almost pleading. "Jake, I'm so sorry. Please, just let me explain." I cut her off, my voice harsh and unrecognizable to my own ears. "Explain! What is there to explain, Linda? I saw everything. I saw you kissing him. I saw everything." She flinched at the venom in my tone, but she didn't back down. "It's not what you think. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just got out of hand." I laughed bitterly, finally lifting my head to look at her. "Got out of hand? You think this just got out of hand? What the hell were you thinking, Linda? Did you even think about me? About the girls? About what this would do to us?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no pity. Just a cold, Hard anger that was as relentless as it was unforgiving. I wasn't thinking, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I was lonely, Jake. You were always so busy with work, with the kids. I just felt like you weren't there for me anymore. I stood up, the anger boiling over as I stared her down. So this is my fault now? You're going to blame me for this? For you screwing around behind my back? Do you even hear yourself, Linda? She shook her head, the tears spilling over, but I wasn't moved. I couldn't afford to be. I'm not blaming you, Jake. I just needed something. I needed to feel wanted, to feel like I mattered to someone. And you didn't think I wanted you? You didn't think you mattered to me? I could feel my voice rising, the fury barely contained. I was out there every day, busting my ass to provide for you, for our family, and this is how you repay me? By fucking some other guy? She winced at the harshness of my words, but I didn't care. I was done being the understanding husband, the one who always put her needs first. This was about me now, about what I had lost, about the betrayal that had ripped my heart out and left me bleeding. I didn't fuck him, she said, her voice trembling with desperation. I swear, Jake, it didn't go that far. We kissed, yes, but that's all it was, I swear. I shook my head, disgusted by her lies. Do you really think that makes it any better? Do you really think that changes anything? She tried to step closer, reaching out to touch me, but I recoiled, as if her touch would burn me. Jake, please, I'm begging you. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away over one mistake. I love you. I've always loved you. I laughed again, a hollow, bitter sound. Love? You call this love? What kind of love betrays everything we've built, everything we've been through together? You don't love me, Linda. You love yourself, and that's all you've ever loved. She crumpled at my words, her sobs filling the room, but I couldn't find it in me to comfort her. I was too angry, too hurt to care about her tears. All I could think about was the man I had left bleeding on the floor of that bar, the man who had dared to touch my wife, who had taken from me what I thought was mine alone. I turned away from her, pacing the room, trying to get a grip on the storm of emotions raging inside me. But there was no calming the fury, no easing the pain. It was too raw, too fresh, and I was drowning in it. I never meant for this to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible through the tears. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, Jake, you have to believe me. I spun around, my patience snapping. Believe you? How the fuck am I supposed to believe anything you say? You've been lying to me for God knows how long. How many times have you done this, Linda? How many other men have there been? She shook her head frantically, her face pale and streaked with tears. No, Jake, it was just him. I swear it was just him. It never went any further. I didn't want it to go any further. Bullshit, I spat, the rage consuming me. You think I'm going to believe that? After everything I saw tonight? You're nothing but a fucking liar. She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off, my voice laced with venom. I trusted you, Linda. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me, by fucking around behind my back. You make me sick. Her tears only seemed to make me angrier, the sight of her crying for herself, for what she had done, pushing me closer to the edge. You think you're the victim here? You think your tears are going to make this better? You did this, Linda. You destroyed everything. There's no coming back from this. I was shouting now, the words spilling out of me in a torrent of rage and pain. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea what you've fucking done? She was sobbing openly now, her hands clasped together as if in prayer, but I wasn't moved. I couldn't be. The only thing I could feel was the burning desire to lash out, to make her feel a fraction of the pain she had inflicted on me. I should have known, I muttered, more to myself than to her. I should have seen it coming. You were always so damn secretive, always on your phone, always making excuses, and I was too fucking blind to see it. Jake, please, she begged, her voice breaking. Please don't do this. I'll do anything. Just please don't leave me. Leave you? I repeated, incredulous. You think I'm going to stay after this? You think I'm just going to forgive you and pretend like nothing happened? You've got to be out of your fucking mind. She reached for me again, but I backed away, my hands trembling with the effort to keep from lashing out. Don't you fucking touch me, I growled, the anger making my voice shake. Don't you ever fucking touch me again. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by her sobs, which seemed to echo through the empty house. I stood there, staring at her, the woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, and all I could see was the betrayal, the lies, the destruction she had wrought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spoke, my voice cold and detached. I'm done, Linda. We're done. There's no fixing this. There's no coming back from what you've done. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. But the anger, the pain was too strong, too overwhelming to allow for any pity. Jake, no, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please don't say that. We can work through this. We can fix this. Fix this? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. There's nothing to fix. You killed it, Linda. You killed us. She tried to reach for me one last time, but I turned away, heading for the door. Don't bother trying to explain, I said, my voice flat. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear anything from you ever again. Jake, please, she cried, her voice desperate, but I was already walking out of the room, out of the house, out of the life we had built together. The door slammed behind me, her sobs echoing in my ears as I walked to my car. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. Not with her. Not with the memories of what I had seen, what I had done. I needed to get away, to clear my head, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. As I drove away, the anger slowly gave way to a crushing sense of despair. The reality of what had just happened, of what I had lost, hit me like a freight train. My marriage, my family, the life I had spent years building. It was all gone, shattered into a million pieces by a single moment of betrayal. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I could ever put those pieces back together again. Driving aimlessly through the night, the city lights blurring past, I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that was settling in my chest. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a dark, growing desire for revenge. Linda's tear-streaked face kept flashing before my eyes, but instead of evoking any sympathy, it only fueled the fire burning inside me. She had torn my heart out, stomped on it, and then had the audacity to beg for forgiveness. The memory of her pleading voice, her desperate apologies, it all felt so hollow, so fake. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not without consequences. Not after what she had done to me, to us. She wanted to cry and beg for mercy? Fine. But I was going to make sure she regretted every single tear. After driving around for what felt like hours, I finally pulled over into an empty parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, calculating, plotting. I wasn't a man prone to violence, but the thought of Linda's betrayal had awakened something dark and vengeful inside me. I wanted to make her feel the pain I was feeling, to make her suffer the way she had made me suffer. And then it came to me. It was almost too perfect. The kind of revenge that would hit her where it hurt the most. Her pride, her image, her carefully constructed facade of being the perfect wife, the perfect mother. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the one I was looking for. Linda's best friend, Stacy. Stacy and Linda had been inseparable since college, and over the years, she had become part of our extended family. She was the kind of friend who knew all of Linda's secrets, the kind who would turn a blind eye to her misdeeds, but wouldn't hesitate to gossip about them behind her back. Without giving myself time to second-guess the decision, I hit the call button. Stacy picked up on the second ring, her voice cheerful and oblivious. Hey, Jake, what's up? Everything okay? I forced a smile into my voice, though it felt like acid on my tongue. Hey, Stacy. Yeah, everything's fine. I just needed someone to talk to, you know? Things are complicated. Her tone shifted immediately, the curiosity and concern evident. Complicated? What's going on, Jake? Is everything okay with you and Linda? I hesitated for a moment, savoring the anticipation of what I was about to do. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I just found out that Linda's been seeing someone else, behind my back. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the gears turning in Stacy's head. She was probably trying to process the bombshell I had just dropped, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much Linda had told her. Jake, I'm so sorry, she finally said, her voice low and cautious. I had no idea. I mean, Linda never said anything to me. I could tell she was lying. Stacy was the type who thrived on drama, who lived for the juicy details of other people's lives. If Linda had been sneaking around, there was no way Stacy didn't know. But that was exactly what I was counting on. Well, I found out tonight, I continued, my voice cold. Caught her red-handed. She was kissing some guy at a bar. Stacy gasped, the sound genuine. But I could tell she was already piecing together how this new information would affect her own standing with Linda. Oh my God, Jake, that's horrible. I don't even know what to say. Yeah, it is, I agreed, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But I didn't call you just to vent. I need your help, Stacy. My help? She asked, clearly taken aback. With what? I need you to do something for me, I said, my tone firm. I need you to spread the word. Let everyone know what Linda's been up to. I want everyone to know the truth about her. There was another pause, longer this time, as Stacy considered what I was asking. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head, weighing the pros and cons of betraying her best friend versus the thrill of being the one to break the news. Jake, are you sure that's a good idea? She finally asked, though I could tell she was intrigued. I mean, this could get really messy. That's the point, Stacy, I said, my voice hardening. She deserves to be humiliated for what she's done, and I know you're the best person to make that happen. There was a pause, and I could sense Stacy's hesitation. She was always the instigator, the one who loved stirring the pot, but this was different. This was her best friend I was asking her to betray. But I knew Stacy well enough to know that her loyalty only went so far. The promise of being at the center of the biggest scandal in our circle was too tempting to pass up. Okay, she finally agreed, her voice steady but with a hint of excitement. I'll make sure everyone knows. But Jake, are you sure this is what you want? I mean, once this gets out, there's no taking it back. I didn't hesitate. I'm sure. She deserves everything that's coming to her. After hanging up, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Stacy would do exactly as I asked, spreading the story like wildfire through our social circles. By the time Linda realized what was happening, it would be too late. Everyone, our friends, our neighbors, even her own family, would know what she had done. Her perfect image, her reputation, everything she had worked so hard to maintain would be in ruins. But I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. As I sat in the car, the engine idling, I thought about the other ways I could make Linda pay for what she had done. She had humiliated me, made a fool of me, and I was determined to make her feel the same. I wanted her to suffer, to feel the same sense of betrayal and loss that I was drowning in. The next idea came to me almost immediately, and it was so cruelly brilliant that I couldn't help but smile. Linda had always been obsessive about her appearance, spending hours in front of the mirror, buying the most expensive creams, and visiting the salon regularly. She was vain, always wanting to be the center of attention, to be admired. And that was exactly what I was going to use against her. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. It was for a man named Derek, someone I had met through work. He was a hacker, a shady character who dealt in the kind of information that people paid good money to keep hidden. We weren't close, but I knew he owed me a favor after I had helped him out of a tight spot a few years back. I dialed his number, and after a few rings, he picked up. Jake, long time no hear. What can I do for you? I got straight to the point. I need you to do something for me, Derek. It's personal, and it needs to be done discreetly. There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear Derek's curiosity peaking. Discreet, huh? That usually means it's something interesting. What do you need? I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I spoke. I need you to hack into my wife's social media accounts. All of them. Facebook, Instagram, whatever else she's on. And I need you to leak some photos. Photos? Derek's tone was skeptical, but I could tell he was intrigued. What kind of photos are we talking about here, Jake? The worst kind, I said, my voice cold and calculated. I want you to find any compromising photos she's taken, anything that will ruin her reputation. And I want them posted everywhere. I don't care if they're old, if they're recent, or if you have to dig through her entire phone to find them. Just make sure they get out. There was a long silence on the other end of the line as Derek considered my request. You know, this is pretty heavy stuff, Jake. You sure you want to go down this road? Yes, I replied without hesitation. She deserves it, and I want to make sure she regrets what she's done. Derek sighed, but I could tell he was already working out the logistics in his mind. All right, I'll get on it. But just remember, once this is out there, there's no going back. I know, I said, my voice firm. And that's exactly what I want. After hanging up, I sat back in the driver's seat, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. I knew what I was doing was cruel, that it would destroy Linda in ways that she could never recover from. But I couldn't bring myself to care. She had broken me, shattered the life we had built together, and this was the only way I knew how to fight back. I drove home, my mind numb with the knowledge of what I had set in motion. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, quiet. I knew Linda was inside, probably still crying, still trying to figure out how to fix what she had broken. But there was no fixing this. There was no going back. As I walked through the front door, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The rage that had consumed me was still there, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that I had taken control, that I was no longer the helpless victim in this situation. Linda was sitting on the couch, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Jake, please," she began, her voice hoarse. "Can we talk? Can we try to work this out?" I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I just stared at her, the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with everything, and felt nothing but cold, hard anger. She tried to stand, but I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't," I said, my voice flat. "Don't say another word." Linda froze, her face crumpling as the realization of what was happening sank in. "Jake, please," she whispered, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that she had finally gone too far. But I didn't care, not anymore. I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there in the darkness, alone with the consequences of her actions. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. Linda had played her game, and now it was my turn, and I was going to make sure that she never forgot what she had done. After leaving Linda in the living room, I retreated to the bedroom, but sleep was out of the question. My mind was racing with thoughts of revenge, not just on Linda, but on the man who had dared to lay his hands on my wife. I had already dealt with him physically, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a few punches weren't enough. He needed to pay in a way that would leave a lasting mark, something that would remind him every day of the consequences of crossing me. The more I thought about it, the clearer my plan became. It was one thing to bruise him up and leave him bleeding in a bar, but it was another to dismantle his life piece by piece, the same way he had torn mine apart. If Linda was going to face the social fallout of her actions, her lover wasn't going to escape unscathed either. I knew a little about him, just enough to get started. His name was Chris, a local guy who had been hanging around the periphery of our social circle for a while. I had never paid him much attention, thinking he was just another one of those aimless mid-30s bachelors who floated from job to job, never really settling down. Linda had mentioned him once or twice, always in passing, and I had thought nothing of it. I should have known better. I spent the rest of the night gathering information. I wasn't tech-savvy by any means, but I knew how to dig up dirt when I needed to. Social media was a goldmine. I found his profiles, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and from there I started piecing together the story of his life, his job, his friends, his habits. It was all laid out in a series of carefully curated posts, and I used every bit of it. The next day I made a few calls, pulling in favors from people I knew around town. Small towns have long memories, and people are always willing to talk, especially when there's juicy gossip involved. By the end of the day, I had enough to start putting my plan into action. Chris worked at a small marketing firm downtown, a place that prided itself on its image and reputation. They handled local businesses, putting together ad campaigns, social media strategies, and all the rest of it. I figured that someone like Chris, who was all about appearances, would be particularly vulnerable to having his carefully constructed image tarnished. I started with a simple but effective strategy: discredit him professionally. I knew people who knew people, and it didn't take much to plant a few rumors about his conduct at work. It was easy to suggest that he had been less than professional with clients, maybe even crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. In a business that thrived on relationships and trust, even the hint of impropriety could do serious damage. But I wasn't satisfied with just hurting his career. I wanted him to feel the same level of humiliation and betrayal that I had felt. I wanted to ruin his reputation, to make sure that everywhere he went, people knew exactly who he was and what he had done. That's when I decided to go after his personal life. I had already gathered enough information about his friends and social circles to know where to strike. I started by reaching out to a few of his closer acquaintances under the guise of concern. I made sure they knew what kind of man Chris really was, feeding them just enough information to set the rumor mill spinning. I also dug deeper into his social media. He had made the mistake of leaving some of his accounts too public, and I used that to my advantage. I found old posts, embarrassing photos, and comments that could be twisted out of context. It wasn't hard to paint a picture of him as a sleazy, untrustworthy jerk who couldn't keep his hands to himself. I spread those around, making sure they reached the right eyes and ears. Next, I targeted his relationships. I found out he was casually dating a few women, none of whom seemed to know about each other. That was all I needed. I sent anonymous messages to each of them, carefully crafted to look like they were from someone who was just looking out for them. I hinted at his infidelity, at his tendency to play the field without caring about the consequences. I knew that once the seed of doubt was planted, it would grow on its own, destroying whatever trust they had in him. I also didn't stop at his romantic entanglements. I made sure to contact his close friends, especially the ones who thought they knew him well. I hinted at his reckless behavior, at the way he used people for his own gain. I knew how to play the game, to make it seem like I was just passing along something I had heard. But it was enough to make them start questioning who their friend really was. It didn't take long for the effects to show. I kept tabs on him through the same social media channels I had used to gather information, and it was clear that things were starting to unravel for him. His posts became less frequent, his tone more defensive. He started losing followers, and the comments on his posts took on a different tone. Less admiration, more suspicion. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to make sure that he knew exactly who was behind the sudden collapse of his life. So, I left him a little present, a USB drive in his mailbox with a single video file. On it was a compilation of everything I had done, a digital roadmap of the destruction I had wrought. I made sure it was clear that this was just the beginning, that I could and would go further if I felt like it. I didn't include any threats. I didn't need to. The message was clear. I had the power to ruin him completely, and I was just getting started. A few days later, I received a message from an unknown number. It was him. He begged me to stop, pleaded for mercy, swore that he had made a mistake, and that he would do anything to make it right. He even offered to leave town, to disappear if that's what I wanted. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His desperation was the only answer I needed. Knowing that he was suffering, that he was living in fear of what I might do next, was enough for me. I had taken everything from him. His job, his friends, his reputation. I had made him feel the same pain, the same helplessness that I had felt when I discovered his betrayal. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the image of him with Linda, the smug look on his face as he kissed her, and any pity I might have had evaporated. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. Satisfied that I had done enough, I turned off my phone and sat back, feeling a sense of closure for the first time since this nightmare began. I had exacted my revenge, and it had been sweet. I knew that this was just one step in a long journey, that there were still difficult conversations to be had, still wounds that needed to heal. But for now, I was content. I had taken control, had fought back against the people who had wronged me, and had emerged on the other side stronger for it. Chris would never forget what I had done to him, and neither would Linda. They had both underestimated me. Both thought that they could betray me without consequences. They were wrong. As I lay down to sleep that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in days, I didn't feel the weight of betrayal crushing me. I had fought back, had taken my revenge, and now it was time to start thinking about what came next. The next few days passed in a blur of tense silences and brief, cold exchanges with Linda. The house, once filled with the everyday sounds of family life, felt eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. The girls were still unaware of the turmoil brewing between their parents, and I was determined to keep it that way. At least until Linda and I could figure out how to handle the situation, but I knew it couldn't last. The unspoken tension between us was unbearable, and we both knew that the time for confrontation was fast approaching. There was no avoiding it any longer. We had to talk about the future, about what came next for us, for our marriage, for our family. I had been avoiding her as much as possible, burying myself in work and finding excuses to stay out of the house. But one evening, after the girls had gone to bed, I knew the moment had finally arrived. There was no more running away, no more pretending that we could somehow move past this without addressing the elephant in the room. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked tired, defeated, like she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. For a moment I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger and betrayal that had taken root in my heart. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, the table between us feeling like a chasm that neither of us could cross. Linda looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but I didn't feel the usual tug of concern. I was too numb, too worn down by everything that had happened. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. "I know. I've been waiting for you to say something. I didn't know how to start." I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "We can't go on like this, Linda. What happened? It can't be undone. And we both know things will never be the same." She flinched, as if my words were physical blows, but she didn't argue. "I know, Jake. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But do you really think it's over? After everything we've been through?" I stared at her, trying to find the right words. "Linda, I don't see how we can come back from this. You broke my trust. You lied to me, cheated on me, and I can't just pretend that none of it happened." Her eyes filled with tears, and she set the cup down with trembling hands. "I don't want to lose you, Jake. I still love you. I know I messed up, but can't we try to fix this? For the girls?" The mention of our daughters sent a sharp pain through my chest, but I knew I couldn't let that cloud my judgment. The girls. They deserve to grow up in a stable home. But a home where their parents can't even look at each other without feeling hurt and resentment. That's not stability, Linda. That's just pretending. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, her voice breaking as she spoke. "So, what are you saying? That you want a divorce?" The word hung between us like a guillotine, ready to fall and sever the last ties that bound us together. I had known this conversation was inevitable, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that I wasn't entirely prepared for. "I think it's the only way forward," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep living like this, pretending that everything's okay when it's not. It's not fair to you, it's not fair to me, and it's definitely not fair to the girls." Linda's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I felt a wave of guilt crash over me, but I forced myself to stay strong. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about finding a way to move forward, to start healing from the wounds that had been inflicted on both of us. After a few moments, she looked up at me, her eyes full of desperation. "Jake, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, please don't take the girls away from me. They're all I have left." Her words pierced through the wall of anger I had built around myself, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Despite everything, I knew that Linda loved our daughters more than anything in the world, and as much as I wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the same pain she had caused me, I couldn't bring myself to take the girls away from their mother. "I'm not going to take them away from you," I said, my voice softening. "They need their mom, Linda. They need both of us. But we have to figure out a way to make this work. For them." She nodded, relief washing over her face, but there was still a deep sadness in her eyes. "Thank you, Jake. I know I've lost your trust, but I'll do whatever it takes to be a good mother to them. I promise you that." "I know you will," I said, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something resembling compassion. "We'll have to work out the details. How we're going to handle things with the girls. How we'll tell them. But we'll figure it out. Together." Linda reached out across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it over mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't return the gesture either. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I didn't know if I ever would be. But for the sake of our daughters, I knew we had to find a way to coexist, to be civil, even if it meant pretending for their sake. "I'm sorry, Jake," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." I looked into her eyes, searching for the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But all I saw was a stranger, someone who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. "I know you are, Linda," I said, my voice distant. "But sometimes, sorry isn't enough." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that there was no going back to the way things were. The damage was done, and now all that was left was to pick up the pieces and try to move forward. For the rest of the evening, we talked about practical matters. What we would tell the girls, how we would arrange our lives going forward, and the best way to handle the transition for their sake. We agreed that Linda would stay in the house with them, and I would move out. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. The girls needed stability, and uprooting them from their home would only make things harder. We didn't discuss the legal aspects of the divorce just yet. That conversation would come later, once we had both had time to process what was happening. For now, it was enough to know that we were on the same page about the girls, that we were both committed to putting their needs first. As the night wore on, the exhaustion of the past few days finally caught up with us. Linda went to bed first, leaving me alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty teacup she had left behind. The house was silent, but the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I knew that the road ahead was going to be long and painful, filled with difficult decisions and even more difficult conversations. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. Not as husband and wife, but as parents who loved their children enough to put them first, even when everything else was falling apart. I stayed up for a while longer, letting the quiet settle around me, trying to come to terms with the reality of what was happening. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were tempered now by a sense of resolve. This was the beginning of the end of our marriage. But it didn't have to be the end of everything. Eventually, I made my way to bed, but sleep was elusive. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Linda in my mind. There was still so much left unsaid, so much unresolved. But at least we had taken the first step. In the darkness, I thought about the girls, about how much I loved them and how I would do anything to protect them from the fallout of our failed marriage. They were the one bright spot in all of this, the one thing that gave me hope for the future. I didn't know what the next few months would bring, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to be there for my daughters, no matter what. And as long as Linda and I could keep that promise to each other, maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward, even if we had to do it apart. The day we walked into the courthouse felt surreal. I had always imagined that courtrooms were reserved for criminals, for people who had done something wrong. But now here I was, standing alongside Linda, both of us about to dismantle the life we had built together. The air inside was cold, sterile, and the walls seemed to echo with the stories of other broken marriages, other shattered dreams. Linda and I had agreed on most of the terms beforehand, not because we wanted to, but because it was what was best for our daughters. We had spent countless nights discussing the details, where the girls would live, how we would handle holidays, and how to split our finances. It was a painful process, but it was necessary. The anger and bitterness that had consumed me in the days following her betrayal had given way to a kind of weary acceptance. I didn't want to fight anymore. I just wanted to move on. As we walked through the courthouse doors, I could feel the tension between us. We were civil, even polite, but there was no warmth left, no connection beyond the shared responsibility of our children. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I glanced at Linda as we made our way to the courtroom. She looked composed, but I could see the strain in her eyes, the lines of worry etched into her face. This wasn't what either of us had wanted, but here we were. Our lawyers had already done most of the heavy lifting. The agreements were drafted, the paperwork was ready, and now all that was left was to make it official. We had agreed that the girls would stay with Linda in the house while I would find a place nearby. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. The girls needed stability, and as much as it hurt to leave the home we had built together, I knew it was the right decision. We sat in the courtroom, waiting for our case to be called. The room was mostly empty, just a few other couples and their lawyers, all of them looking just as somber and resigned as we were. I tried to focus on the proceedings, but my mind kept drifting to the girls. How would they react when we told them? Would they understand? Would they blame us? These questions had been haunting me for weeks, but now that the moment was here, I felt a strange sense of calm. We had done everything we could to make this as painless as possible for them. Now we just had to hope that it would be enough. Finally, our case was called. We stood and made our way to the front of the courtroom, where the judge was seated behind a large wooden desk. He was an older man, with a face that looked like it had seen far too many divorces. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, then looked up at us with a tired but not unkind expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor," he began, his voice deep and steady. "I've reviewed the terms of your divorce agreement, and I see that you've both agreed to the terms without contest. Is that correct?" We both nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. The judge looked from Linda to me, his gaze steady. "You've both agreed that the children will remain with their mother in the family home, and that Mr. Taylor will have visitation rights, with no restrictions other than those already laid out in the agreement. Is that correct?" Again, we nodded. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something in our expressions. "I want to make sure you both understand the significance of what you're doing here. Divorce is not just the end of a marriage. It's a significant change in the lives of everyone involved, especially your children. I see that you've both agreed to put their needs first, and that's commendable. But I need to know that you're both fully aware of the responsibilities that come with this decision." Linda spoke first, her voice steady but soft. "We understand, Your Honor. We've thought about this long and hard, and we're committed to making sure our daughters have as much stability as possible during this transition." I nodded in agreement, feeling the truth of her words. "Yes, Your Honor. We're both committed to putting the girls first. That's the most important thing to us." The judge seemed satisfied with our responses, and he nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Very well. I'll approve the terms as laid out in the agreement. Your divorce will be finalized today." He paused, looking at us with something that almost resembled sympathy. "I know this is a difficult time for both of you, but I encourage you to remember that while your marriage may be ending, your roles as parents do not. You'll need to work together, perhaps more closely than ever, to ensure that your children are supported and loved through this process." His words hung in the air, a sobering reminder of the reality we were about to face. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I forced it down. This was what we had agreed to, what we both knew was necessary. There was no turning back now. The judge signed the papers, and just like that, it was over. Our marriage, once full of hope and promise, was now nothing more than a legal document, a set of signatures on a piece of paper. The judge dismissed us with a final nod, and we were left to gather our things and leave the courtroom, now officially no longer husband and wife. We walked out of the courthouse in silence, the enormity of what had just happened weighing heavily on us. The sun was shining outside, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning inside me. I glanced at Linda, wondering what she was feeling, but her face was unreadable. We had both been through so much in the past few weeks that it was hard to know what to feel anymore. As we reached the parking lot, I finally broke the silence. "So, I guess this is it." She stopped and turned to face me, her eyes filled with sadness. "Yeah, I guess it is." There was so much I wanted to say, so many things I wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood there, two people who had once loved each other deeply, now reduced to strangers with a shared history. "I'll start looking for a place tomorrow," I said, trying to focus on the practicalities. "I'll make sure it's close by so it's easy to see the girls." Linda nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's good. They need you, Jake. I don't want them to feel like they're losing you too." "I'm not going anywhere," I replied, my voice firm. "I'll always be there for them, no matter what." She gave me a small, sad smile, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. I know you will. We stood there in the parking lot, the weight of our decision pressing down on us, neither of us knowing what to say next. There was no more anger, no more accusations, just a deep aching sense of loss for what could have been. I guess I'll see you around, I finally said, the words feeling hollow as they left my mouth. Yeah, she replied softly. I guess so. With nothing left to say, we turned and walked to our separate cars, the distance between us growing with each step. As I got into my car and started the engine, I glanced back at her one last time, watching as she drove away. It felt like the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that I had once thought would last forever. The drive home was a blur, my mind too numb to process what had just happened. When I pulled into the driveway of what was still technically our house, I sat in the car for a few moments, trying to summon the strength to go inside. I knew the girls would be waiting for me, unaware of the changes that were about to unfold in their lives. I had dreaded this moment, the conversation where we would have to tell them that their parents were no longer going to be together. But as painful as it was, I knew it had to be done. They deserved the truth, and they deserved to hear it from both of us. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself for what was to come, and then opened the car door. It was time to face the consequences of the choices we had made, to begin the process of building a new life from the ruins of the old one. As I walked up to the house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality wash over me. This was it, the beginning of a new chapter, one that I hadn't planned for, but one that I would have to navigate all the same. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for certain. I was going to do everything in my power to make sure my daughters knew they were loved, even if their parents couldn't love each other anymore. The days that followed our court hearing were a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The divorce was final, and the legal battles were behind us, but the emotional toll of everything lingered like a shadow over my daily life. I had moved into a small apartment not far from the house, close enough to make sure I could be there for Sarah and Lizzie whenever they needed me. It wasn't home, not in the way our house had been, but it was a start. The apartment was modest, with bare walls and minimal furniture, but I didn't mind. I wasn't ready to make it my own yet. It felt like a place of transition, a waiting room between the life I had known and whatever lay ahead. Most nights, I would sit on the small balcony, staring out at the city lights, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. It was a strange feeling, being alone after so many years of sharing my life with someone else. The silence was both a comfort and a reminder of what I had lost. Seeing the girls was the one bright spot in the midst of all the upheaval. They had taken the news of the divorce better than I had expected, though I knew it would take time for them to fully understand what it meant. We had sat them down together, Linda and I, and explained as gently as we could that things were going to be different. There were tears, of course, and questions that we couldn't fully answer, but we promised them that we both loved them and that we would always be there for them. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but it was also the first step toward healing. Despite everything, Linda and I had managed to remain civil. There were no more shouting matches, no more accusations, just a quiet understanding that we had to make this work for the sake of our daughters. We communicated through text messages and brief phone calls, coordinating schedules and making sure the girls had everything they needed. It wasn't the partnership we had once had, but it was something, and for now, it was enough. I threw myself into work, finding solace in the routine and the distraction it provided. My colleagues were supportive, though I could see the pity in their eyes whenever they asked how I was doing. I wasn't ready to talk about it. Not with them. Not with anyone. The wounds were too fresh. Too raw. Instead, I kept busy, taking on extra projects and working late into the night, anything to keep my mind occupied. But there were still moments when the reality of my situation would hit me like a freight train. I would find myself standing in the grocery store, staring blankly at the shelves, trying to remember what I needed to buy for dinner. Or I would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching out instinctively for the space where Linda used to sleep, only to find it cold and empty. Those were the hardest moments, the ones where the loneliness would creep in, threatening to overwhelm me. One evening, a few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I found myself sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by boxes of old photos and memories. I'd brought them with me when I moved out, not knowing what else to do with them. There were pictures from our wedding, from family vacations, from holidays spent together as a family. Each one was a snapshot of a life that no longer existed, a reminder of the happiness we had once shared. I picked up a photo of Linda and me from our honeymoon. We were on a beach, laughing, her arms wrapped around me as we posed for the camera. We looked so young, so full of hope for the future. I stared at the picture for a long time, my emotions a tangled mess of regret, anger, and sadness. How had we gotten here? How had everything gone so wrong? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers, only the cold, hard reality that the life we had built was gone, replaced by something I didn't yet understand. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I fought it down. I had cried enough. It was time to start moving forward. With a heavy sigh, I began packing the photos back into the box. I wasn't ready to throw them away, but I wasn't ready to look at them either. They were a part of my past, a chapter that had ended, and now it was time to figure out what the next chapter would be. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to take on a new rhythm. I started making the apartment feel more like home, adding small touches that reflected who I was now, not who I had been. I put up new pictures, of the girls, of places I wanted to visit, of things that brought me a sense of peace. It was a process, a gradual rebuilding of my life, one piece at a time. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years as I focused on my marriage and family. They welcomed me back with open arms, and I found comfort in their familiar faces, in the memories we shared. We started meeting up for drinks, for dinners, for long conversations about life and everything we had been through. It felt good to talk, to laugh, to remember that there was still joy to be found in the world, even after everything that had happened. But the most important part of my new life was the time I spent with Sarah and Lizzie. Every weekend, they would come to stay with me, and we would make the most of our time together. We went to the park, to the movies, to the zoo. Anything that would make them smile, that would remind them that their dad was still here for them, no matter what. Those weekends became the highlight of my week, a reminder that, despite everything, I still had something worth fighting for. The girls were adjusting to the new arrangement better than I had feared. They seemed to take comfort in the routine, in knowing that even though their parents were no longer together, they still had two homes filled with love. Linda and I continued to communicate, to coordinate, to make sure we were on the same page when it came to parenting. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and for the sake of our daughters, we made it work. As the months passed, I found myself slowly coming to terms with the reality of my new life. The pain of the divorce was still there, but it had dulled, becoming a background hum rather than a constant ache. I was learning to live with it, to accept that some things were beyond my control. I couldn't change the past, but I could shape my future, and that was what I was determined to do. I started going to therapy, something I had resisted for a long time. It wasn't easy, opening up to a stranger about my deepest fears and regrets, but it was necessary. The therapist helped me unpack the emotions I had been carrying, to understand why things had happened the way they did, and how to move forward without letting the past define me. It was a slow process, but it was also incredibly freeing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making progress, like I was finally beginning to heal. One day, after a particularly tough session, I decided to take a drive out to the countryside. I needed to clear my head, to get away from the city and all the memories it held. I found myself at a small park, a place I had visited once or twice with Linda and the girls, but hadn't been to in years. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, and as I walked along the trail, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I stopped at a bench overlooking a small lake, the water shimmering in the sunlight. I sat down, letting the quiet of the place wash over me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to just be. No worries, no regrets, no anger. Just a moment of calm in a world that had been anything but. As I sat there, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze, I realized something important. I had spent so much time looking back, mourning the life I had lost, that I had forgotten to look forward. The future was still there, waiting for me, full of possibilities I hadn't even considered. I didn't know what it held. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months, and took one last look at the lake. It was time to stop dwelling on the past, to stop letting the pain of what had happened define who I was. It was time to start living again, to embrace whatever came next with open arms. Driving back to the city, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't the same man I had been before the divorce, but that was okay. I had been through the fire, and I had come out the other side stronger, more resilient. I had a new life to build, new memories to create, and I was ready to face whatever challenges came my way. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, the sun beginning to set on the horizon. As I stepped out of the car, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of a nearby window. I looked different, older, perhaps, but also wiser. The pain was still there, but it was no longer the defining feature of who I was. That evening, I cooked myself a simple dinner, something I hadn't done in a long time. I poured a glass of wine, set the table, and sat down to eat, savoring the quiet, the solitude. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the future, about what I wanted it to look like. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to keep moving forward, one step at a time, until I found my way. I was going to be there for my daughters, to show them that even when life knocks you down, you can always get back up. And as I drifted off to sleep, a small smile on my lips, I knew that I was finally ready to start the next chapter of my life. A chapter that I would write on my own terms, with hope, with courage, and with the knowledge that I had the strength to overcome whatever came my way.